The smell of a hospital never changes. It's the scent of artificial, sterile peace, a mixture of heavy-duty disinfectant and the faint metallic tang of oxygen. It's a scent that tries to hide the truth of what happens behind those double-swing doors. The lights in the hallway were a harsh, vibrating white. They didn't just illuminate, they scrutinized. They made everything look flat, clinical, and disposable. I was sitting in the corner of room 402. The chair was molded plastic, designed for efficiency, not comfort. At 72, your body becomes a finely tuned sensor for inefficiency. My lower back was sending a steady pulse of irritation to my brain, a low-level alert, like a red light blinking on a dashboard. On the bed, my husband, David, was sleeping, or perhaps he was just drifting. The monitor beside him hummed a rhythmic electronic lullaby. Beep, pause, beep. It was the sound of a heart functioning on a borrowed timeline. My son, Thomas, was standing by the window. Thomas is 45 now. He has the kind of posture that comes from decades of sitting in high-backed leather chairs and making decisions that affect thousands of people. He was wearing a navy blue suit, tailored, expensive, and completely out of place in this room of faded gowns and plastic tubes. He didn't know I was awake. I had been keeping my eyes closed, letting my breath fall into the slow, shallow rhythm of a woman who had finally been defeated by exhaustion. It was a tactical choice. In my years managing the regional distribution center for Northway Logistics, I learned that the best way to understand a system is to observe it when it thinks no one is watching. A young man in a gray suit, not a doctor, not a nurse, but someone with the sharp, predatory look of a junior associate, stepped into the room. He walked with a quiet, practiced step, keeping his heels from clicking on the linoleum. He didn't look at David. He didn't look at me. He looked at Thomas. He reached into a leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. Even from 10 feet away, I could recognize the weight of the parchment. It wasn't standard office paper. This was legal grade, heavy, permanent. Thomas took a silver pen from his breast pocket. It was the pen David gave him when he made partner. I remembered the day clearly, the way David's eyes had shone with a pride that was almost painful to witness. "Is the witness ready?" the young man whispered. His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the hum of the heart monitor. Thomas glanced at the bed. Then he glanced at me. I kept my breathing steady. 1, 2, pause. I let my head tilt slightly to the left, the way it does when I'm in a deep, dreamless sleep. "She's out," Thomas said. His voice was different. Usually, when he speaks to me, it's loud, slow, and overly patient, as if my age had somehow damaged my ability to process English. But now, his voice was crisp, cold. It was the voice of a man closing a deal. "Sign here and on the last 3 pages," the associate said. I watched through the slit of my eyelashes. Thomas didn't hesitate. He didn't even read the pages. He had already vetted this. He flipped through the stack with the practiced efficiency of a man who dealt in volume. The silver pen moved across the paper. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was small, but in that sterile silence, it sounded like a saw cutting through bone. I caught a glimpse of the heading on the 3rd page as the associate turned it. Transfer of title and power of attorney. Beneath that, in bold black letters, irrevocable. My name was there. David's name was there. And the address of the house David and I had spent 40 years paying for, the house where we had measured Thomas's height against the kitchen door frame every birthday. Thomas signed the final page. He handed the pen back to the young man. "We'll have the notary stamp these downstairs," the associate whispered. "The transfer will be effective at midnight. You'll have full control of the estate before the weekend." "Good," Thomas said. He didn't look at the papers again. He adjusted his cuffs. "Make sure the liquidation of the trust assets is handled discreetly. I don't want any flags at the bank." "Of course, sir." The young man slid the papers back into his briefcase and vanished as silently as he had arrived. Thomas stood there for a moment, looking out the window at the city lights. He looked victorious, as if he had just cleared a bottleneck in a supply chain. He didn't see me as a mother. He saw me as a depreciating asset, a final hurdle in a strategic acquisition. I remained still for 20 more minutes. I waited for his breathing to change, for the tension in his shoulders to drop. When I finally woke up, I did it slowly. I rubbed my eyes. I let out a soft, tired sigh. "Mom, you're awake," Thomas said. He was back to his grandma voice, loud and condescendingly sweet. He walked over and patted my hand. His palm was cold. "I must have drifted off," I said. My voice was thin, mimicking the fragility he expected. "Was anyone here? I thought I heard talking." Thomas smiled. It was the kind of smile you give a child when they ask a question you have no intention of answering truthfully. "No one, Mom. Just the nurses checking the machines. Go back to sleep. You need your rest." I looked into my son's eyes. They were the same eyes I used to kiss every night before I tucked him in. Now they were the eyes of a stranger who had just stolen the ground from under my feet. "You're a good boy, Thomas," I said, letting my voice trail off. "I know, Mom. I'm taking care of everything." He thought he was. He thought that because I was 72, I had forgotten how to read a ledger. He thought that because I walked with a cane, I couldn't defend my territory. He thought I was too old to understand. That was his first mistake. In logistics, you never assume a shipment is lost until you've tracked every node in the network, and you never, ever underestimate the person who built the network in the first place. Thomas stood up to leave, mentioning an early meeting he couldn't miss. He kissed my forehead, a clinical, perfunctory gesture. As the door clicked shut behind him, I didn't go back to sleep. I sat up. My back still hurt, the lights were still harsh, but the fog of exhaustion was gone, replaced by a clarity as sharp as a diamond. I reached into my handbag and pulled out my phone. It was an older model, but its encryption was top tier, a gift from an old friend who used to run cybersecurity for the Department of Defense. I didn't call the police. I didn't call my lawyer. I called a man named Silas, a man who had been my most ruthless competitor for 20 years before we both retired to the quiet life. "Silas?" I said when he answered. "The shipment has been intercepted. The internal audit is compromised." There was a long pause on the other end. "Clara? I haven't heard from you in 5 years. What's the target?" I looked at the heart monitor beside David. Beep, pause, beep. "My own son," I said. My voice wasn't thin anymore. It was the voice of the woman who had once controlled 40% of the logistics on the eastern seaboard. He thought he was running a hostile takeover. I want him to help me liquidate his leverage. "When do we start?" Silas asked, his voice sounding younger, hungrier. I looked at the door where Thomas had just walked out. "Immediately," I said. "And Silas, I want it to be precise. I want it to be surgical, and I want him to see it coming just long enough to know it was me." I hung up the phone. The hospital smell was still there. The lights were still vibrating, but the room didn't feel like a place of defeat anymore. It felt like a war room. Stay with me, because you're about to see what happens when you try to steal from a woman who spent her life accounting for every single cent. Thomas thought he had signed my future away. In reality, he had just signed his own eviction notice from my life, and in this family, the interest on a debt of betrayal is very, very high. The monitor continued its indifferent pulse. Thomas sat in the chair by the window, his attention diverted to his smartphone. The glow from the screen cast sharp, unflattering angles on his face. He looked like a man checking a stock price, not a son sitting with his dying father. I lay there, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of harsh hallway light. I felt a strange sense of detachment. It was the same feeling I used to get when I found a discrepancy in a high-priority shipment, a cold, clinical focus that pushed emotion into a small, well-sealed box. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he asked, not looking up from his device. "Tired, Thomas," I whispered. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth he thought it was. The medicine makes everything foggy. "That's good. You shouldn't have to worry about anything." He finally looked at me, and I saw it. A brief flicker of impatience, a tiny twitch at the corner of his eye. Most people would have missed it, but I had spent 30 years reading the micro-expressions of vendors who were trying to hide a late delivery. He was in a hurry. He wanted this day over. He wanted the transition period to end so he could begin the optimization of his new assets. "Is David doing better?" I asked, gesturing weakly toward the bed. "The doctor says he's stable," Thomas replied. His tone was dismissive, the way one might talk about a piece of warehouse equipment that still had a few months of utility left. "But it's time to start thinking about the long term, Mom. Security, efficiency. You shouldn't be carrying the weight of all these responsibilities." His words were polished like smooth stones, but beneath them I could hear the grinding gears of a plan that had been in motion for a long time. I nodded, closing my eyes. "Whatever you think is best, Thomas." The lie tasted like copper in my mouth, but in logistics, you never reveal your inventory until the shipment is secured. This was not how I had envisioned this week. David and I were supposed to be in Vermont. We had planned this trip for 3 years, a quiet drive to see the leaves turn, to stay in that old inn with the uneven floors and the smell of wood smoke. David had been so excited. He'd spent weeks tuning the car, checking the maps, making sure his heart medication was packed in a waterproof case. "A final tour, Clara," he'd said, his voice raspy but full of life, "before the winter sets in." But the winter had come early. A sudden collapse in the hallway, the sound of his cane hitting the hardwood, and then the sirens. I expected Thomas to be our anchor. I expected the son who used to hide behind my legs when lightning struck to be the man who would hold our world together. Instead, I found a man who looked at his father's hospital bed as if it were a balance sheet in the red. Every time a nurse entered the room, Thomas was there with his clipboard, asking about legal clarity and resource allocation. He wasn't asking about David's pain or his comfort. He was asking about the timeline of the inevitable. I looked at David's hand, the hand that had built our house, the hand that had held mine through 40 years of logistic strikes, economic downturns, and the slow, grinding process of raising a child. His skin was like tissue paper. His pulse was a faint, irregular vibration. He deserved a son who would hold his hand. Instead, he had a son who was busy signing away his life's work in the shadow of a heart monitor. The betrayal didn't start today. It just got documented today. And as I sat there in that sterile room, I realized that the Vermont leaves would turn red without us, and I would have to make sure that David's legacy didn't fall as quietly as a withered leaf. I caught the reflection of the papers in the glass of the window as Thomas held them up for the associate. My vision has always been my greatest asset. Even now, without my glasses, I can see the small anomalies, the way the ink sat on the page, the specific arrangement of the paragraphs. Transfer of asset, 1422 Sycamore Drive. Authorization for immediate liquidation. Irrevocable beneficiary, Thomas D. Miller. The words hit me with the force of a physical impact. Sycamore Drive, the house, But it wasn't just the house. I saw the name of David's retirement trust, the legacy fund we had built for the grandchildren's education. Thomas was signing it all. He was collapsing our entire infrastructure into a single reachable account. "Just a bit more paperwork, Mom," he had said earlier when I saw the associate enter. "Just some insurance adjustments to cover the hospital costs." A lie, a bold, unfiltered discrepancy. In business, a discrepancy this large is usually a sign of fraud. In a family, it's a sign of an ending. He thought I didn't see the watermark of the law firm, Blackwood and Associates. I knew that firm. They didn't handle insurance. They handled aggressive estate management. Their specialty was making sure the elderly felt safe while their assets were quietly redistributed to the next generation. I looked at Thomas's reflection in the glass. He was smiling, a thin, tight-lipped smile of satisfaction. He saw a house. He saw a fund. He saw a solution to his own mounting debts I had suspected for months, ever since I saw the urgent notices from his venture capital firm. He was using his father's heartbeat to buy himself another quarter of solvency. I didn't blink. I didn't cry. I just began to memorize the names of the documents. I tucked them away into the folders of my mind, ready for audit. Because when the shipment is stolen, the first thing you do is secure the evidence. It didn't happen all at once. The rot always starts at the edges. I remembered a dinner 6 months ago. Thomas and his wife Victoria had come over. They brought expensive wine and a forced cheerfulness that felt like a poorly rehearsed play. "Mom," Victoria had said, her voice dripping with artificial concern, "don't you find the stairs at Sycamore a bit challenging? Maybe it's time to think about a place with more service, a managed environment." I laughed it off then. "I managed 10,000 square feet of warehouses for 20 years, Victoria. I think I can handle 12 stairs. But then the help started arriving. Unsolicited financial consultants who called to offer retirement optimization. "Your son mentioned you might be interested in consolidating your accounts for better visibility," they would say. I had ignored them, thinking Thomas was just being a good boy, being overprotective. Then there was the day I found Thomas in David's study. He was looking through the filing cabinet. When I walked in, he didn't jump. He just closed the drawer with a calm, practiced motion. "Just looking for a copy of David's birth certificate for the legacy application, Mom." A lie. I knew where the birth certificate was. It was in the safe. He was looking for the deeds. He was looking for the passwords. He was conducting a preliminary inventory. He was mapping the territory before the invasion. I had seen the signs, the missing mail, the accidental deletion of David's digital banking app from his tablet. "Oh, it must have been a software update, Dad. I'll fix it later." He never fixed it. He replaced it with his own login. I sat in the Ashir chair, my fingers tracing the cold plastic armrest. I had been too trusting. I had seen the discrepancies and assumed they were errors. In logistics, there are no errors. There are only failures of oversight. And I was finally taking back the clipboard. "Mom, you don't need to worry about this. Let the professionals handle it." That had been Thomas's mantra for the last 2 years. He had started small, choosing the restaurant for lunch, then choosing the insurance provider. Soon he was the one managing the holiday plans, the car maintenance, even the gardening service. He made me feel like a visitor in my own life. Every time I tried to ask a question about our finances, he would pat my hand and give me that look, the one that says, "The old engine is failing. Just let it idle until the scrapyard is ready." "It's complicated, Mom. The new tax laws are a nightmare. You've earned your rest. Let me carry the load." He hadn't been carrying the load. He had been relocating the weight. He was systematically stripping me of my autonomy, one favor at a time. He was making me invisible so that when the time came to sign these papers, there would be no one left to object. He had even convinced my neighbors that I was getting a bit forgetful. "She's fine, really," I heard him tell Mrs. Gable from across the street one afternoon. "Just having some trouble with the details lately. We're keeping a close eye on her." Character assassination, it's the standard procedure before a hostile takeover. You discredit the management before you replace the board. I looked at Thomas now as he stood by the window checking his watch. He was already mentally in the next phase. He was already spending the liquidation price of Sycamore Drive. He thought he had silenced me. He thought the grandma persona was a permanent condition. He forgot that a manager who knows the rhythm of the warehouse doesn't need to shout to be heard. She just needs to wait for the right moment to jam the conveyor belt. And that moment was coming. Silas hadn't changed. 20 years on the other side of the bidding table had turned his hair white, but his eyes were still two pieces of polished flint. We met in the hospital cafeteria, a place of beige walls and the smell of burnt coffee. It was the perfect node for a clandestine handover. "You look tired, Clara," he said, sliding a manila envelope across the laminate table. "I'm 72, Silas. I'm entitled to be tired. What I'm not entitled to be is foolish." I opened the envelope. Inside was a series of digital traces. "Your son doesn't just have debts," Silas said, leaning in. "He has a leak. He's been funneling his firm's venture capital into a series of shell companies controlled by a group in the Caymans. He's not just liquidating your house to pay his bills. He's liquidating it to buy his way out of an embezzlement investigation." The coldness I had felt in the hospital room tightened. This was no longer just a family betrayal. This was a criminal liability. "And the papers he signed tonight?" I asked. "Blackwood and Associates already filed the preliminary transfer with the county recorder at 11 p.m. They used a fast-track digital notary. By tomorrow morning, legally speaking, Sycamore Drive belongs to Thomas, and by Friday, it will be listed as collateral for a high-risk bridge loan." "He's moving fast," I noted. "Because he's desperate," Silas replied. "The audit at his firm starts on Monday. He needs the cash on the books before the opening bell." I looked at Silas. We had spent decades trying to destroy each other's market share. Now he was the only person in the world who knew the truth of my cargo. "Can we reroute the shipment, Silas?" A thin smile touched his lips. "In logistics, the only thing faster than a delivery is a recall. I've already contacted the regional fraud investigator, and I have someone inside Blackwood's digital server. We don't just reroute it, Clara. We incinerate it." I took a sip of the lukewarm coffee. It tasted like ash, but for the first time in days, I felt the gears of the system beginning to turn in my favor. I returned to the room. Thomas was gone, replaced by a night nurse who was checking David's IV. "He's restful," she whispered. I sat back in my plastic throne. I pulled out my own laptop, the one Thomas thought was broken. I logged into the server Silas had provided. The numbers hummed on the screen. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the legacy fund. Thomas had tapped into David's life insurance. He had filed a pre-humus disbursement request, claiming that the costs of David's intensive terminal care had exhausted all other resources. He was essentially betting on his father's death to pay for the service fee of his own crimes. Every word in that document was a knife. Terminal status confirmed. Financial hardship of the primary caregiver documented. He had used my name for that part. He had painted me as a helpless, destitute widow-to-be, begging for the insurance company to release the funds early so I wouldn't starve. He was using my vulnerability as a forged signature. I looked at David. His face was peaceful, oblivious to the fact that his own son had turned him into a insurance payout on legs. In my world, this isn't called estate planning. It's called asset stripping. It's what you do to a company before you let it go bankrupt and walk away with the pension fund. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not sorrow, competitive fury. Thomas thought he was a player in the big leagues. He thought his navy blue suits and venture capital jargon made him the smartest shark in the tank. He had no idea he was dealing with the woman who had survived the 1990 shipping wars. "Audit complete," I whispered to the empty room. The strategy was set. Now it was time for the implementation phase. Wednesday morning came with a pale gray sky. Thomas returned at 8 a.m., looking even more polished than before. He brought me a croissant from an upscale bakery. "I handled the insurance stuff, Mom," he said, dropping a kiss on my cheek. "You don't have to worry about the hospital bills anymore. It's all settled." "That's wonderful, Thomas," I said, even managed a small, trembling smile. "You've always been such a provider." I watched him. I watched the way he winced slightly when his phone buzzed. I watched the way he checked the door every time a doctor walked by. He was waiting for David to die, not because he hated him, but because David was the final signature he couldn't forge, the one on the death certificate that would release the final block of assets. I sat there playing the role of the grandma in the corner, while in my mind I was moving pieces across a global chessboard. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask about Blackwood and Associates. I didn't ask about the Cayman accounts. Silence is a powerful tool in a negotiation. It creates a vacuum that the other party will eventually fill with their own mistakes. Thomas was filling the vacuum with his overconfidence. He thought the deal was closed. He had already moved the cargo in his mind. He didn't notice that my phone was plugged into the hospital's secure Wi-Fi. He didn't notice that I was sending a series of encrypted files to his firm's board of directors. He didn't notice that the grandma he was patting on the head was currently launching a DDoS attack on his legal credibility. "Are you okay, Mom? You're very quiet today." "Just thinking about the future, Thomas," I said. "It's a very different landscape than I expected." "Things change, Mom. You have to adapt." "Exactly," I agreed. "You have to adapt, or you get left on the dock." The first blow landed at 2 p.m. on Thursday. Thomas was in the hospital room when his phone didn't just buzz, it screamed. He stepped into the hallway to take the call. I watched him through the glass. His posture, usually so rigid and certain, began to crumble. He looked like an orlop deck during a storm, buckling under the weight of the sea. "What do you mean, frozen?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "That's a family trust account. You have no authorization." I didn't need to hear the other end of the conversation. I knew what the bank was saying. Suspicious activity detected, irregularities in the power of attorney filing, compliance holds applied. Silas had done his job well. Thomas stormed back into the room, his face the color of old cement. "Mom, did you call the bank? Did you talk to someone about the Sycamore house?" I looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. "The bank? Oh, Thomas, I haven't talked to the bank in months. You're handling all that for me, remember?" "Then why is the account locked?" he hissed. He was losing his CEO mask. The predator was being cornered. "Maybe it's a software update," I suggested, using his own words against him. "Or perhaps they found a discrepancy in the manifest." The color drained from his face at that last word. "Manifest? What are you talking about?" "It's a logistics term, Thomas," I said, my voice dropping the grandma octaves. "It's when the cargo on the paper doesn't match what's actually in the crate, and when that happens, the entire shipment gets seized for audit." I stood up. I didn't use my cane. I stood straight the way I used to when I was addressing a board of 30 men. "The board of your firm has the files, Thomas. The forensic investigator in the Caymans has the transactions. And Blackwood and Associates, they just received a restraining order from a judge who doesn't like digital forgeries." The room went silent save for the heart monitor. Beep. Pause. Beep. Thomas looked at me as if I had just grown a second head. You did this? I didn't do this, Thomas. You did this. I just conducted the audit. I walked over to the bed and touched David's hand. He was breathing easier now. The doctors had adjusted his medication, and for the first time in days, his eyes were clear. He was watching us. He was listening. I spent 40 years building a legacy with this man. We built a house, we built a fund, we built a company, and we thought we had built a man. Mom, I can explain. I needed the money to save the firm. You needed the money to save your ego, I corrected him. You were willing to trade your father's dignity for a quarterly report. You were willing to make me a prisoner in my own life so you wouldn't have to admit you failed. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my bag, not a legal grade parchment, just a standard piece of hospital stationery. This is my new will and my new medical directive. Silas is my primary signatory now, and Sycamore Drive, it's being donated to a medical foundation in your father's name. The legacy fund is already moved to a trust that you will never touch. Thomas collapsed into the plastic chair. The mighty CEO looked like a broken toy. You're leaving me with nothing? I'm leaving you with exactly what you tried to leave me with, autonomy. You're a young man, you can rebuild, you can find a new supply chain, but you won't be using ours. I looked at David. He squeezed my hand, a small, weak gesture, but it was enough. Get out, I said. Mom, that's not my title anymore. In this transaction, I'm just the auditor, and your account is overdrawn. The hospital room was quiet again. Thomas had left 20 minutes ago. Silas had messaged to say the final blocks were in place. The hostile takeover had been neutralized. I sat by David's bed. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the room. It was no longer the harsh white of the surgical lights. It was the soft, warm light of an ending. David was looking at me. You always were better at the books than I was, he whispered. I smiled, a real smile this time, one that went all the way to my eyes. Logistics, David. It's all about the timing. I looked out the window. The city lights were coming on. Far below, the traffic moved in its endless rhythmic patterns, a system that never stops, even when the individuals within it change. I thought about Thomas. I felt a pang of sadness, a dull ache in the box I had sealed away. I had lost a son today. But in truth, I had lost him years ago when he stopped seeing us as people and started seeing us as obstacles. But I had gained something back, my own name, my own house, my own future. Most people see a 70-year-old woman and they see a story that is finished. They think the ink is dry and the book is closed. They don't realize that sometimes the best part of the story is the final chapter, the one where the auditor finds the error and sets the record straight. I took a deep breath. The air still smelled of antiseptic, but beneath it, I could almost smell the wood smoke of Vermont. We might not make it to the end this year, but we were still in the driver's seat. I leaned over and kissed David's forehead. Rest now, I whispered. The shipment is safe. The legacy is secured. I sat back in my chair and watched the stars appear. He thought I was too old to understand. That was his first mistake, and as the heart monitor beat its steady, rhythmic tune, I knew it would be his last. Because in this life, you can lose everything, your money, your house, your position, but you never, ever lose the truth. And the truth is, I'm Clara Miller, and I'm right where I'm meant to be. Home.